What up team, lovely to have you aboard. Today we are taking an item off my backlog and getting it done. We're going to add a service worker to aerotwist.com. Now, you might be thinking, aerotwist.com is not a PWA, why is he adding a service worker? And it is true that service workers are normally used for PWAs to take them offline. But you can use them for a kind of progressive enhancement, performance move on static content sites like Aerotwist, in order to maybe take blog content offline, which is something eventually I would like to do, but also to just kind of smooth the way. So for example, if there are styles or images or whatever that you'd like to make sure are cached and served up directly from a service worker, you can do that. And that can be a good way to just kind of smooth performance issues. That said, if you get your caching right with the HTTP cache, you'll probably be okay. So it's not strictly a necessary move. For me, I want to get to a point where I can take blog content offline on my site. So for me, adding a service worker, it's a good excuse, frankly, and it lets me show you around the service worker stuff, which I said I'd do, and I'm doing. So with that said, let's take a quick look at what we've got here so far. Now, on my screen, I have this service worker source.js file. And if you've not seen my lightweight build tooling video, you probably want to, because I'm using that here to convert the service worker and the fact that I've got this double curly braces name and version over to something that gets baked out like this, Aerotwist-3.0.0. And these come from the package.json file, which you can see here. And I have a simple build script that goes through, uses rollup, and actually replaces these with whatever the current values are. And it becomes very, very useful for versioning service workers in a little bit. Okay, so what else do we have going on in here? Firstly, there's this onInstall event, then there's onActivate, and then there's onFetch. When you get a service worker up and running on your site, the first thing it does is it installs. And that's kind of where it goes off and gets any images or CSS or HTML or whatever assets you actually need to be served from your service worker. So when somebody requests something, as in when somebody loads your site or your app, all the requests are going to go through the service worker. And so you probably want to have some stuff ready in a cache somewhere. And that's exactly what the install step is typically used for. Once the service worker is installed, there's a second step where it actually activates and kind of kicks in, it boots up for the first time. And that's where you typically do any cleanup. So for example, imagine this situation. You've got a service worker and then you update it to a new version. Well, old caches or old files or old databases or any of those things, they probably need cleaning up. And that's what the activate step is for. It's the, I'm new, I have a new service worker, I'm here, let me tidy up the old stuff that's no longer needed from the old service worker. Once activated, the onFetch, this last one here, this will be fired every time we get a request. And that includes, say for example, the index HTML or what have you. Now, we can decide what we do in any of these steps. That's completely up to us as the developer. And today, my service worker is going to be fairly lightweight and fairly straightforward. Even though the code might look a little bit convoluted at times, nonetheless, this is the lightest weight way of doing it. And you could use Workbox to do a lot of these things. And if that's your thing and you want to use an abstraction, go for it. My typical approach, as you may know, and if you don't, you're about to find out, is to kind of go to the platform. I love explaining and I love understanding how the platform works before I go to abstractions. Abstractions are amazing. They are great. But for me, they're a necessary step after I've gone and understood what's going on. Like, what would the abstraction actually be doing for me? And then when I look at the abstraction, oh, okay, I see, that's the kind of thing you're doing. For me, it lets me make better decisions. So treat that as you like, really. Okay, so there's two things here. Firstly, we need to actually do something in our install. And then secondly, in our page, we need to actually register the service worker as being something that we'd like to install. The first thing to do, actually, I'll leave that where it is. I'm going to just go event.waitUntil. So what this does is it tells the event that we want to wait for some promise somewhere to resolve before we consider this job complete. And so what we would want to do here is we would probably want to do something about opening a cache and putting some files in it. Now, in my case, I'm just going to pop in the CSS from my site. So let's go with that. Let's start here, caches. And that's an API that you find in both Window and in Service Workers. that lets you open up a cache. So I'm going to do open, caches.open. This returns a promise to a cache, as you can see on screen. And in here, let's do name dash version. So we're going to open a cache called errortwist-3.0.0. Then with the cache, and I'll tell you what, I'll bump this down here. With the cache, we need to do something. So in order to keep the promise chain going, we're going to return, oh, I don't need that semicolon, do I? We're going to return cache.addAll. And this returns a promise. And the promise will fulfill, be resolved, be all okay if everything inside of addAll, so this array of items, is cached correctly. Or is, sort of 200s or whatever. If we hit any 404s or 500s, then the addAll would fail and the install step would fail. So in here, I'm just going to go with CSS errortwist.css, which is the CSS for my site. That's all I'm going to cache, and I'm doing that mostly for demonstration purposes. So our install step is to open a cache called errortwist 3.0.0 or whatever the current version is, and then we're going to add the CSS to the cache. So we can check that that works, because what we can do is we can go over here into our HTML, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the service worker registration code, and I've got a little bit of it already in place here. I have an async function that's called init. Couldn't think of a better name. Naming is hard. And it has an early return statement right here. It says if service worker doesn't exist in Navigator, so if we have a browser that doesn't have service workers implemented yet, bail, don't worry about it. It's a progressive enhancement. We're not going to require a service worker. It's just if you've got the ability to run them, whichever browser you are, let's go for it. So what we can do is we can say navigator.serviceworker.register. And the first thing that we give it is a path. And so I'm going to give it the service worker.js file. And because this is async, I can do const registration, which is what we get back, equals await the register call there. So with the registration, we can do a few things, and we're going to say on update found. And on update found is going to fire whenever there's a new version of the service worker. Point of note here, our service worker is going to be tested every single time the page loads, by which I mean, even if you set the service worker JavaScript file to like live forever, with caching set to forever ever, the browser will ignore you specifically when it comes to the registration call. It will always check to see if there's a new service worker file, and it will check on a byte-wise basis. So if it's byte different in any way, the service worker will begin its installation process, and that will trigger on update found here. So we're going to go with on update found, and we're going to do this, and we're going to say console.log, and I think we do registration.state maybe? No, it's not registration.state. What is it now? It's installing.state. So the registration.installing will get us a reference to the installing service worker, and we can ask for its state like so. We can also do something with that installing service worker. We can say registration.installing.onStateChange. I'm going to do this as a function because it rebinds what this is to the installing service worker. So then I can say console.log this.state. In fact, we'll just change this one up here to say installing new service worker, like so. And then we should see some state changes as we go through the process. So for example, we should see the installing process, and then we should see it saying activated, because the installation process was this one, the on install. We should see that, and we should see it say installing. And then we should see that it gets activated because there's no reason for it to not activate, because there's no service worker in there yet. So that should all work. Let's head over to the browser and see how that's looking. So if we refresh, hey, there we go. All right, so there's a few things to pick apart here from the console. On install, that came from the service worker itself. Then in our page, we got the registration callback, the on update found. Yep, that's the right one. Installing new service worker. That seems good. Then we get the service worker saying, I'm done with my installation, I'm activating. And then it reports these state changes back into the callback. So all being well, we have a service worker that's in place here. We can check inside of DevTools because we can go to the application tab and we can go to service workers, and all being well, somewhere down here, we will see that, in my case, number 468. So I've done quite a lot of testing on local hosts, so that's why that number is probably so high. It's up and it's running. It's happy. It's doing its thing. We should also be able to see in the cache storage. Interesting. We should also be able to see in the storage that the caches is there, but we don't currently see that. So I have a bug in my code somewhere. So let's go back and see if we can find it. I think I didn't build my service worker, which I probably should have done. So let's try that again. What I'm going to do, and this is a useful thing to know about as well, if you go to clear storage in DevTools, you can unregister service workers as part of the tidy up, and it will clear up everything else as well. So we're going to clear site data, and now what we do is when we refresh, hopefully we will now see in the cache storage, yes, there we are. Error twist 3.0.0 is there with the CSS file and content type and length and whatever the time it was and everything else. So that is all as we would like. So we've got an active, ready to go service worker. All good. Now let's talk about the update process. What I want to do is I want to go ahead and update it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do version 3.0.1 like this. Okay. And I'll build it again. I'll remember to do that this time. And what will happen is we will get a new version coming in like that, you see? So it's going to install a new service worker. It's installed, but if we were to look inside the service worker stuff over here, we'll go down to the bottom, you'll see that the current one that we have, 475, is activated and it's running, and then 476 is waiting to activate. And we could skip waiting here, which would immediately activate this service worker. So I'll do that, and the new one's activated. But what we've got here is we've got the old cache still around, the 3.0.0, as well as the new 3.0.1. And so that's what the activation callback is going to help us do. We're going to go in there and we're going to find any old caches, and we're just going to go ahead and remove them. So similar to before, we want to do event.waitUntil. And what we're going to do is we're going to say caches.keys, which is a promise to an array of cache names. That's what we're going to go for. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to say .then. In fact, we'll just do that. .then. Then. There we are. So we get an array of cache names, like so. Okay, now what we'd like to do is we would like to return a promise to .all of delete old caches, like so. So we actually, and again, I don't need that semicolon, force of habit, there we are. So we need to do something where cache names becomes an array of promises to delete the old caches. So what we can do is we can say cache names, and it's an array .map, and that will be a cache name on each iteration. And what we'll do is we will go here and we'll say const delete old caches equals that. So what do we do? Well, we say, well, if the whatever cache you're looking at, whatever the name of that cache is, if it's not the same as name version, like that, if it's not the same as whatever the new cache is, we can say return caches.delete cache name, like so. So what we're doing here is we're saying go through each of the caches, and then for each of the caches that you find, remap the cache names such that if you find that the cache name is not the new one, the newly installed one, get rid of it. And then for clarity, we'll just do promise.resolve for, so this is the current cache, leave alone. Whereas this one is old cache, please remove. Okay, so that should tidy things up, and we can test this by going to 3.0.2. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to programmatically skip waiting. We can do that here in the install. We can say self.skip waiting. So instead of clicking that button in DevTools to skip the waiting, I can actually say in my install step, I want you as the new service worker to skip. I just want you to go straight in and activate. So that, all being well, will work. So we'll build that. And what we should see is There we go. Boop. And the old caches are deleted. Marvelous. So we've done a bit of tidy up in our activation step. And we've also done the skipping waiting. Now you've got to be careful with skip waiting, because by doing so, you could potentially find yourself in a mid-ground where you've got old pages controlled by an old service worker and you skip the waiting on the new one and it's activated and tidied things up, and you just probably want to be a little bit cautious about doing that. What you normally want to do is you want to wait until the page has completely gone away. So we call them clients on service workers, all the clients are disconnected, and then you reboot the tab and you get the new version. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Doing the skip waiting is a slightly more, I would say, aggressive move, shall we call it, to say, no, go straight to that new service worker. In my case, because I've just got one file, it's not that big a deal. The other thing we can do as well is we can also say in our activation, from this point on, I would like you to use me for all your future fetches. And the way we do that is we say self in the service worker, self.clients, which is all the available tabs, anybody who could connect to this service worker who would be controlled by this service worker, and I'd like you to claim them. And claiming is your way of saying, from this point on, everybody talk to me when you're trying to do your fetch. Okay? So now, on fetch, this is firing. Every request that we make for the index, for any of the images, blah, 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 we just call onFetch. And by default, because our onFetch is doing nothing, it's just logging out onFetch, we just get that for every request that we're making. And that's going to be falling through to the HTTP cache, hopefully, and it's going to be returning the assets that we need. All good. What we'd like to do now is we'd like to make sure that where we can, we use the cached versions of our assets, and where we can't, we'll just fall back to fetch, which is what we're currently doing. So because the onFetch is empty, the browser just goes, I'll just do the network thing. I'll just go and get it as you expected. Sure. You haven't told me to do any different, so I'll just assume that's what you want. As soon as we start to take control of this process, we're going to be responsible for making sure everything happens a-okay. So we can do that. First of all, we'll do this actually. We'll do event.waitUntil. We can get the request here. So we can do that, and we can say fetch event.request. So what we're doing here is we're saying whatever you're going to request, fetch it, which returns a promise, and I'd like you to wait until that completes. That is essentially a pass-through at this point. It's doing what the browser was going to do. We just happen to have written the JavaScript for the same thing. So that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we could probably just test that that works, and we'll bump our version to make sure that everything is as we'd expect. So we'll go to 3.03. Okay, let's refresh. We get a full-on install, so on. We won't see anything, but the page is still working. So over here in the network tab, we can actually have a look at some of this. You can see that we actually see our request for the local host, and in this case, for example, the CSS is actually double requested. One comes from the page, and then the other one actually comes from the service worker itself. Interesting. So we actually see individual requests from page to service worker and service worker to network. What we want to do though is, in the case of particularly this error twist CSS, we don't really want to fetch it anymore. We've already got it in a cache. So we should add that code in. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go into our waitUntil, and we're going to say caches.match. And that is going to give us either a response, which is the thing that we put into the cache earlier for the CSS in our case, or it's going to give us a falsy response, i.e. I don't have that thing that you wanted. So we can do the event.request. So do you have this request? Do you have the thing that we're looking for? Then with the response, which may not exist. Okay. No, that's not right. That is faulty syntax there, Paul. There we go. We can do that. Okay, so if we have a response, as in if we managed to do a cache match against our asset, we can return the response. That will work. Failing that, we'd like to return a fetch. So this is our kind of sort of pass through. So before we just fetched it no matter what it was, this time we're being a little bit more specific about it and saying, well, if you got something for this request in the cache, then grab it and return it. So match found, return. Match not found, go to network. Okay, so we will now bump this to 3.0.4 and go again. We should do an install here. There we are, all the usual stuff. All being well, up here we would see that errortwist.com came from the service worker. We can confirm this because what we can do is we can go back here, we can say console.log match found for event.request URL, like so. Build again. I'm not going to bump the version this time because there's no need to. It'll install and activate. And you see match found for errortwist.css. So in summary, we've now got a service worker in place where we are caching some assets. In my case, just the CSS. I might just expand this after recording here to include a few more assets that would just benefit from being in a cache somewhere. And then a further step that I might do a video on is actually enabling the user to take a blog post offline, which would involve figuring out which assets are needed for a particular blog post and popping those in their own cache, and then augmenting that on fetch so that it knows where to pull particular assets. So for example, if you take one blog post offline, what images do you need? What HTML do you need? Whatever do you need? Fonts, that kind of stuff. What do you need in place to be able to give that blog to somebody when they're offline? But that starts to get a little bit more complicated and convoluted. And as you can see, we've already had a long video just talking about the life cycle and everything that's involved so far. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you have, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will catch you on the flip side. That was an exceptionally long video, and it took a lot of takes because talking about service workers is pretty challenging when you're trying to keep it quick. Bravo for sticking it this far. Frankly, you're a hero. You stuck it out to the end. Not a lot of people stick it out to the end. I know that from the retention stats, but you're watching this and I'm glad you are. I'm just going to sit here marveling at you holding on to the end. Well, this is awkward.